Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. On today's show, we are looking at migration through a fresh lens by observing the similarities and differences among humans, birds, and other migratory animals. I've worked with both of today's guests individually on separate productions in the past. Maria-Elena Hincapié is an immigration scholar and attorney at Cornell Law, previously teaching and talking with us about immigration policy, politics, history, and storytelling around the immigration experience. Amanda Rodewald joined us previously from Cornell's Lab of Ornithology in the series Reimagining Citizenship, which was in partnership with the Einaudi Center at Cornell, where we looked at how computer scientists and ornithologists are using big data to study movements of birds and large migratory patterns. Welcome back to both of you. Thanks for joining today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It is lovely to see you. Maria-Elena, I want to start with you. No, I want to start with our audience. Viewers, thank you for joining. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I'll get them here and we'll take them roughly in the order that they come. So thank you so much for submitting those if you like. Maria-Elena, having you two on the show together makes sense now, but partnering up an immigration lawyer and an ecologist might not strike one of our viewers as the most natural fit. So I want to ask you, how did you two come together, and how did we arrive at where we are today doing this show?
Yes, thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to share my love of both people and birds in one sitting. And thanks to everybody for watching today. As an immigrant from Colombia, I have always loved birds. A fun fact is that Colombia is the country in the world that has the greatest number of birds species. I think it's over 1,900. So 1 out of every 5 birds in the world lives in Colombia. And of course, they travel and migrate, which we'll talk more about. But about a little bit over a year ago, when Steve Yalor, who's the director of Cornell's Immigration Law and Policy program, reached out and invited me to join Cornell as a visiting scholar, the thing that most attracted me to Cornell, believe it or not, was that Cornell had at that time a global challenge on migration and was looking at migration across species. So when I started, the first thing I did was reached out to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which I'm a sustained member of, and found Amanda, who was also part of the migration initiative at the time. And Amanda and I have been in conversation for over a year now, really thinking about different ways to collaborate. And this is one of those examples.
Lovely that you two were able to come together so quickly. So Amanda, let's look at migration at its broadest level among species, particularly birds, which is your area of expertise. So how do you define and how do you talk about migration?
Yeah, great question. And so we do have slightly different definitions for migration if you're thinking about human migration versus non-human migration. And so what I'll do is I'll just share a couple of slides, just a fun way to take a look here. So let's see. So right, I think we're all familiar with migration and the fact that it is just this incredible just phenomenon that happens around the world. And it happens with many different species, wildebeest, salmon, monarchs, and you're probably familiar with this. But of course, some of the best known migrants that we have are birds. And birds just capture the imagination of people around the world because we can actually experience this migration in real time in our own backyards, right? We can see birds, different species there at different times of the year. And so when we talk about migration too, before I get into some of the details with terms, I just want to recognize that they're really, migration and migratory birds are really these living metaphors for how we're connected across countries, across continents and hemispheres on the planet. So here, what you're looking at, each little dot represents a different species of bird, and you're looking at the center of its distribution as it migrates over the course of the year. So you can see these birds are moving south, and that's the center of their distribution in the non-breeding season, and then they move back up north. So it gives you an idea of how birds really connect people and places as well. So what do we mean by migration then? Okay, well, migration is when we think about non-human migration, we're talking about a predictable, bidirectional movement that happens every year. So here in this eBird animation, we're looking at one species, the Swainson's thrush. And so here we're seeing it move onto the breeding grounds, and the darker the color represents where it's more abundant. And we can see over the course of the year, it moves from breeding areas in North America, migrates through the US, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, and then can spend the winter there and returns. So again, migration is that bi-directional movement. So you might be wondering, okay, why on earth would a species choose to traverse, this distance? It's so energetically demanding. It exposes them to all sorts of risks. Well, the reason is pretty simple, right? Birds, salmon, wildebeest, whatever species migrates, it's doing it fundamentally because of resources. Like us, they need resources in order to survive and to reproduce. They need food, they need, appropriate temperatures where they can survive, safety from predators or other hazards. And so that is what is doing it. So you can imagine for like a Swainson's thrush, in the breeding season, it can go and take advantage of these flushes of insects. If you've ever hiked around northern latitudes, right? Lots of insects, good bugs to feed your kids growing up. You have long days, warm temperatures, but in the winter, it's just not going to be as suitable. So that's why then you start seeing movement to other locations. But of course, that's all the plus side of why a bird might move. But migration isn't that simple. And so birds are exposed to many different dangers, right? They're traveling through sometimes unfamiliar terrain. There may be habitat that's used to be available. It's no longer there. Habitat as it's being degraded may no longer provide the resources it needs. Navigating unfamiliar terrain also exposes them to hazards that may pop up over time, or they're persistently there. So for example, with birds, many fly at night. They're facing danger with collisions in our big cities because lights are attracting them to cities where then they become disoriented and will hit tall buildings or communication towers. They're exposed to extreme weather that can cause, death or injury, and also to predators, or other dangers. And so it's not surprising then to, if you think about most studies of mortality across the year for birds, find that it's highest during migratory periods. So that parallel is one thing that Maria Elena and I have been talking, where you have some of the similar hazards that any moving animal is going to face, human or non-human, as they're trying to migrate. But in the context of this conversation today, we really want to highlight an additional challenge that birds don't face, and that is that social component, right? And I think this Banksy art really signifies it well. Birds aren't facing a lot of the narrative or demonization that we sometimes see with human migrants. And so that's why we're really excited to be here today and to discuss some of those similarities and some of the dissimilarities between humans and birds as they're migrating. So I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Amanda. Lovely slides. Maria Elena, I'm going to turn to you. So when we're talking about migrants, immigrants, refugees, humans, words and definitions do matter. Help us out here. Distinguish between some of the words that I've just used and what they mean to you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris, and lovely presentation, Amanda. So just like birds and other species, people have been migrating since we have existed and will continue to migrate and move. So I'll start with the term migration and immigration. So at the very core, it simply refers to people moving, right? Basically, whether you're moving from one place to another for temporary reasons or permanent reasons, whether you're going whether it's circular migration, you're returning back to your home country, right? But it is basically just that piece of moving. And in the United States, we tend to use the term immigration. The rest of the world actually uses the term migration. And you also will hear immigrants and migrants, but they basically mean the same thing. And, we often think about migration or immigration referring to people moving from one country to the other. But one thing to be mindful of, for example, in the United States, the Great Migration is still considered one of the largest internal migrations movements of people in our history in the United States. And it refers to the migration of approximately 6 million African Americans who moved from the rural southern United States to urban areas in the north. And that was between 1916 and 1970. And they did so for a combination of reasons, right? But due, on the one hand, the push factor being the racist and dangerous and violent conditions under Jim Crow laws in the South at that time, but also because there was a demand for labor in the North, particularly as a result of the industrial labor happening after World War I. And that's what resulted in Black Americans moving. So back to terminology. So migrants and immigrants, right? Again, that's a person who moves from one place to another. Then we have refugees, and that refers to both refugees and asylum seekers or asylees, refers to someone who has fled their home country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. And that persecution could be due to race, religion, nationality, ethnic or indigenous identity, gender identity, or particular membership in a particular social group. And for refugees, they are going to a particular country under which they will apply for refugee status and stay there until they are vetted for national security purposes, et cetera. And then they are, once they're determined to be a refugee, then they have access to going to another country. Asylees, or people who are asylum seekers, basically the same thing, except they have arrived at a country. So here in the United States, we've been seeing a lot of this with people arriving at the US-Mexico border or at a port of entry, whether it's at the land or at an airport, for the same reason, applying because they fear persecution in their homeland. Then we have the term irregular migrant or undocumented migrant, which again is the term. Irregular is what's used in the rest of the world. Undocumented is what we'd refer to here in the United States. And that refers to someone who is in the country without lawful status. And that could be because they entered across the border or because they entered on a visa and overstayed their visa. And then lastly, I'll just refer again to internally displaced people, because that's a common term that we'll talk a little bit more later when we talk about climate. But again, that's the movement of people, usually forced displacement internally within a particular country.
Thank you. So in a callback to what Amanda was discussing just moments ago, we learned a little bit about why birds and other species may migrate, resources, sustenance, et cetera. Do people move for similar reasons to birds? Where's the overlap there?
Absolutely. So like birds, people are migrating primarily for survival reasons. They also move for love, for opportunities, safety, and freedom is the way I like to think about it. And so at its core, there are two basic types of migration. One is voluntary migration, and the other is forced migration. For voluntary migration, that is when people are choosing to move for educational, so to come study at Cornell, for example, or for employment opportunities, or to be reunited with loved ones. My family, for example, when we immigrated from Colombia to the United States, that was because my father had been recruited to work in a textile factory in 1970. And then out of love, he wanted to make sure that my mother and he decided that we would have better economic opportunities for my 9 siblings and myself. And today, my siblings, nieces, and nephews work in the health profession. They're educators, they're the biochemists, they're social justice activists, and business leaders as well. Forced migration is really what happens when people have no choice, right? They are forced to leave their home country due to factors such as war, conflict, persecution, and environmental disasters, which we'll talk more about as well.
Perfect. I want to kick it back over to Amanda. Forced migration was one term that jumped out at me there. Amanda, you had shown some of the hazards, the obstacles to, for birds migration, right? The ever-present house cat was one that jumped out at me there. So tell us about other human activities that may impact migration.
Yeah, and it turns out there are a lot of the human activities that impact bird migration also are, in many cases, having impacts on human migration as well. So with migratory species, birds and other species, by far, human activities that result in the loss of habitat or its degradation. In other words, where, where a species, where an individual usually would be able to reasonably find the resources it needs to survive, either that habitat's missing or it's been degraded to the point where it can no longer provide those resources. That's going to affect species. So in the case of migratory birds, right, they need habitat. So I'll just step back. All species need habitat. Doesn't matter if you're migratory or resident species. All people need habitat, right? But for a migratory species, it's extra complicated because they require habitat at geographically distant places. They need it on the breeding grounds, right? If they're, breeding in the north, they need it in where they're spending the overwinter. But they also need these, what we call stopover locations. So points along their migratory journey where they can stop to rest and to refuel and to have safety from the hazards or the predators that they're facing, or, harvesting, sometimes they're harvested or exploited during migration. So that's really a major factor. And of course, there are, these structures that I mentioned that can affect them. And I would say these, like the collision structure there, that analogy would be just barriers. It's really any sort of barrier or structure that can either directly kill a migrating individual or can prevent its movement. And there it just sort of dies by default. Climate change is another factor that it can make migration more dangerous, sort of in real time, if you have severe weather events, that increase the risk of death from exposure. But it also, because climate change changes the timing of resources, that can affect the likelihood they're going to find the resources they need as they're migrating. And climate change has both direct and indirect effects on that first factor I mentioned, habitat, right? Because through climate change, we can be losing habitats. If we think of shorebirds that are moving, they need, wetlands, they need mud flats and coastal areas. Well, we might be losing those because of extensive droughts or due to sea level rise, for example. Right. And so we can find that migratory species are really subject to all of these pressures, that they're being faced, directly. And of course, as climate change is forcing movements, or I guess shifts in where human activities and human residents are located, that's also exacerbating the amount of habitat loss and degradation that we're seeing.
All right, Elena, so similarly, how does human activity in this instance, we're talking about climate change generally, how does this affect the movement of peoples? What are we seeing? What have we seen in recent years, and what can we anticipate?
Yeah, I mean, like Amanda said, first and foremost, right, it's habitat. It's about the need. We all need shelter. And so that's probably the most important impact that climate change is having on all of us across the world. But like birds, climate change is already resulting in increasing the number of people that are being forced to leave their homes. We see individuals who are displaced by environmental disasters, whether that's rising sea levels, hurricanes, fires, extreme weather, floods, or droughts, right? I think a number of those. And it's often not an immediate, right? It could be a hurricane forces people to have to migrate immediately, or an earthquake. Sometimes it's a much slower, slow pacing climate disaster that's happening over time. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But this could also result in internal migration. And so one of the places we see this again is Hurricane Katrina, for example, in the United States, which was the most recent, a large climate disaster that caused such a large number of people having to leave their homes. And some people were never able to come back. Some people were able to come back. What's interesting on the impact of climate change on human migration is that although climate refugee is a term, or climate migrant is a term that is starting to be used more regularly, there actually is, it's not a recognized term under international law. And, this is one of the big areas of work that's going to be needed, or that is needed already, I would argue. The other thing is, as I mentioned, climate change doesn't necessarily lead to increased migration immediately. Like what we might see is that there's a displacement of people indirectly. So if there's a drought, for example, and you've got someone who lives in a coastal area where they're primarily dependent on fishing, that drought or the change in weather may result in them suddenly not being able to fish and not being able to make a livelihood. And so they may move from their village to the urban area in their home country and start looking for work. And then because of increased heat, then they are now having to look for other work. And then slowly you start seeing a little bit of what like Amanda was describing with birds. You start seeing changes in behavior that ultimately sometimes result in people moving or being forced to migrate across national borders as well.
Right. And so, there's varying rates of change, and the perception, or what we all feel, is that it's been slow, and now it's really starting to kind of pick up the pace, right? So, my question is, does climate change, it feels like it's accelerating migration. Do things happen more rapidly? What is that always the case? Amanda, I think I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in many cases, right, it does seem to be, but there are some really interesting exceptions. So, for example, one that might be familiar to some of the listeners today is Canada geese. So Canada geese is like the most common goose that you would see across North America. And in fact, they've become so abundant in some places. They're quite pesky, they can be a real problem. So what we've seen with Canada geese population, so that's a species that was historically migratory, right? I mean, isn't that the iconic in the autumn? It's like the geese flying overhead, honking. Well, some Canada geese, now their populations, especially within urban areas, are now becoming resident. So they're no longer migrating, right? And they're doing this, in fact, for the same reasons, ironically, that some species are migrating more. And that is because in urban areas, geese are finding that it's warmer and there are plenty of resources available for them to survive over winter. So if they can survive and thrive without having to migrate, all the better. And we see other examples of this, like in Europe, the blackbird also in some cities has lost, it's no longer migrating. So so we do find exceptions, but I would say the commonality is still that the same reasons that force some species to migrate are also the same ones that in these exceptions are making it where they don't really have to anymore.
Is there a Canada geese analog among people, Marielena? Anything similar?
Not in terms of like a particular species. I mean, I think the example that I gave earlier about the slow pace of some of the climate migration, it does not necessarily lead to accelerated migration. And I think for people, I think the way I think about this, Chris, is that it's important to look at the ability to have when it comes to climate in particular, but for other reasons as well, resources, food, shelter, economic and educational opportunities, is for people to have the freedom to stay in their homeland. And, this is about, particularly when it comes to climate, is to ensure that people have the freedom to stay closer to their family, to their loved ones, to their culture, and to their support systems. This requires that we really look at climate resilience and supporting people in rebuilding their homes and their communities, and be able to make a livelihood in their closer to home, or in their, back to their community that was impacted by climate. And it also requires that we look at adaptation strategies, right? How do people learn and develop the skills and get the financing that they need to rebuild their homes, their communities, to make sure that we're addressing the inequitable impacts of climate, particularly for the people who live in the global South that are just disproportionately impacted needed, and on the climate front lines as well. The converse of that is the freedom to move, right? Which is that not everybody can stay home, right? We've got climate emergencies that do end up forcing people, increasing numbers of people to have to move. And that, again, could be internal displacement within a particular country or a particular region of a country, or it may require people to move across national borders. And so, although, as I mentioned earlier, climate refugee or climate migrant is not yet recognized under international law, the term is starting to gain more momentum and points to the fact that there's a gap in our legal international framework. And for people who have no option but to leave their homes, we do need policymakers to ensure that the availability of safe and orderly internal or international migration pathways that provide that freedom to move with safety.
Hey, there's a resource we want to share with our viewers. Heads up, viewers. We're going to drop something in the chat. The Climate Migration Explainer was something that you had tipped me to earlier. We're going to share that with our viewers. What can we understand by checking out the explainer?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, because this is such an important phenomenon and it's going to be or is already the greatest driver of migration, for people who are interested in this topic of migration and climate and the impact it has on the movement of people, it's a great way to understand the basic terminology and understand what happens both internally within a country as well as internationally, and then what some of the potential policy recommendations might be.
So you both have drawn parallels between humans and non-humans, birds or otherwise. And I want to understand a little bit, we've talked about it a little bit, but what are some of the challenges that they share? Where's their overlap? Are we dealing with particular challenges, all of us, all the species on the planet? Are there differences? Help me with that one. We've got some more reporting to do on that, or rather more resources to share on this. Amanda, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, sure. And so I guess one of the things that we know based on recent reports, like from UN Convention on Migratory Species released earlier this year, a major report about the state of migratory species on this planet. And yeah, so with species, about half of the migratory species are in decline. And so what we learn and what that report really highlights is that migration is becoming more and more fraught. It's more and more dangerous over time, really across species. And so some of those factors, again, we've mentioned habitat loss and degradation, sometimes overexploitation, is happening, associated with movement. I guess what I would highlight here is that one of the really commonalities, if we think about what's making migration so much more dangerous and really threatening migratory species and humans that, are forced to migrate, is that it's not a matter of whose needs, which needs do we address? Is it birds or is it people? Is it the salmon? Or is it the monarchs, right? It's really, we're dealing with, because habitat loss and degradation are some of the major drivers of this and the effects of climate change through those, we're actually supporting all species that are moving by addressing, improving habitat and improving the ability of the environment to support, healthy populations, healthy individuals. I'll just mention too, like the World Health Organization a few years ago, it released a report that showed that 1 in 4 premature global deaths around the world, 1 in 4 individuals who die prematurely, the cause is an unhealthy environment. So it's not a choice. It's not even an altruistic choice, right? To take steps that will help migrating birds, or people, allowing people to really have the resources they need to live in their homes and their native lands. This is something that actually affects all of us, even for those of us who have no intentions to move to new communities. That healthy environment is really kind of lifting the boat of everyone.
I love that so much, Chris. Can I just chime in there? Because I think that to me is why this conversation is so important, right? Because it talks about our interconnectedness as beings, as living beings. And I would add to that, not just birds, but, trees and all beings, right? Which is, how do we build a society in a world that actually benefits all of us, right? Where we use our both human, financial, and other resources, natural resources, to build a more sustainable world and planet where we all can thrive, right? So there's like the importance of the freedom to thrive. And so, here is where I would say that these both birds and people face significant challenges and risks during migration. And as Amanda mentioned, right, for birds, it's facing things like threats of predators, adverse weather, habitat loss. And for humans, it's those very same things. And I would add, for humans, there's violence, right? There's human trafficking, there's exploitation, as well as the impact of border controls and natural barriers. I was recently reading the new book by Sonia Shah, who is a scientist who wrote the book, The Next Great Migration, which is really about looking at all, again, migrant species. And, she had this statistic which talks about how we are currently in the world, for the first time in our history, erecting more border walls all over in many, many countries. And the impact it's having on people migration is zero. Actually, what it's having is an impact on birds and other species that are actually dying as a result of that. You do have people who are dying because they're finding different ways. They're basically feeling that they're choosing the most the ways to be able to cross a land border, but it's not actually deterring them ultimately. But what it is having is this impact on species. We've seen that, for example, with monarch butterflies as well at the U.S.-Mexico border, and other species as well. So that's kind of at that macro level. But the other thing that I would just point to in terms of other challenges is, the motivation and decision making, right? So we already heard from Amanda that birds migrate just naturally, largely instinctual. They're driven by biological needs like people are. And there's also some genetic programming, whereas for human beings, right, they're driven by a complex mix of social, economic, political, and environmental factors that often, on the one hand, involves some conscious decision making, and sometimes there is no choice because of those drivers of migration pushing people out, particularly when it comes to forced migration. The other thing that I would say is that, as you heard from Amanda as well, we have kind of when I think about it, is like the scale or the permanence of migration. So on the one hand, Amanda shared that birds, it's bidirectional, right? Birds are migrating and then returning to their homeland, or to their breeding place. And for people, sometimes it involves a much more permanent change of residence, even when, if we think historically, even in the United States, how many people migrate and thought, we're going to return to the old country eventually. We're just going for a couple of years. And then they end up, like perhaps the Canada goose, remaining and staying in the new country, their new adopted home. But for people, often it's a result of human and social interaction, right? And so they arrive at a particular community in their new country, and they integrate into the existing one. They've learned the language, they have a job, they're raising children, they're perhaps falling in love, or having other opportunities that they decide, this is my home country, this is now my adopted home. And so that ends up being a much more permanent location. And then the last one that I just wanted to raise, because it's one that I've been thinking a lot about lately, is technology and kind of infrastructure, which is, for people, migration is both increasingly supported or hindered by the use of technology and infrastructure. And I think we're going to see even more of that over the next decade at an accelerated rate with respect to AI, artificial intelligence, and the impact of AI on jobs and every part of our life, basically. But for birds, I think one of the things that I've learned so much about over this last year is how birds rely on natural navigation systems, such as the Earth's magnetic field, stars, and landmarks, and almost without technology, they're able to make their migration, which to me is just like one of the most fantastic, fascinating things I've learned.
Which brings me to, Amanda, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I was just going to add too, and I think a lot of those examples are just so salient and highlight to whether it's like the conservation and the environmental work, the barriers, the motivations that would drive movements of people or birds, really requires collaboration and cooperation across governments, right? And policies that we cannot really deal with either anticipating, predicting migration, understanding how it's playing out, ameliorating, how do we manage some of the unfortunate drivers, forcing people or other species to move, that we need to work across government. So that's also a similarity that you see across migratory species, irrespective of which one. Yeah.
Yeah, which brings us here. The through line in the conversation that I'm hearing is that birds don't recognize borders, but people sure as heck do, right? So are there examples of international approaches, regulation policy, shared understandings, whatever it might be, that actually support migration and like in the instance of countries that receive migrants? Any examples? Amanda, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so with birds, I mean, the classic one would be the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this was an act that was, signed over 100 years ago between Canada and the US. Also, there are different versions that include Japan and Russia, but it protects migratory species. And so it was, the motivation for that was really just the logic, right? The basic logic that, well, if we want to make sure that birds that are that we could, our birds here in the US that also are spending part of their time and are considered, very much like in Colombia. I work there, and it's like, well, actually, our birds in the US are spending way more time in Colombia than they are up here. So Colombians would consider them their birds. And so, but if we each want to make sure that we have persistent and healthy populations of migratory species, it requires that everyone be participating. And also, so we have legislation like that really helps to set more of a regulatory framework. But another element that goes along hand in hand is the resources. Maria Elena mentioned like the global South has, been really challenged in many respects because of, just the differential in resources and access to, funding to do conservation work, to do restoration that not only improves things for biodiversity, but also actually helps support livelihoods, the health of people living in those systems. Having programs where we can have funding from the global north to actually help support those, activities that are supporting people and the planet in the global south or in other areas is extremely important. And we do see some of these, like the Southern Wings. Southern Wings is a program that's run through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, so state agencies in the US, where now state agencies have the ability to, still in a limited sense, but to provide funding outside, actually give funding to other countries where, some of the species they're concerned about managing are spending the winter. And we need more of those kinds of resources kind of across the board.
Hey, I have a question, and we might be stretching out beyond our purviews here, but I thought it was relevant to what we're talking about here. I have a question from viewer Barbara, who asks, Maria Elena, I'm going to direct this to you, and you let me know if you're good with it. Do you believe that the $5.2 billion in funding through the USAID programs have been effective? The funds were provided to various countries in Central and South America to provide training for jobs. How familiar are you with this legislation?
I'm a little familiar with it, so definitely not expertise. But what I will say, and actually Barbara's question is great because it was a little bit of what I was going to talk about following what Amanda just shared, which is I'm going to take a step back first, right? Which is as we've been talking about, right, migration is a global phenomenon. It is a natural phenomenon. Every species migrates, and that has been the case and will continue to be the case forever. However, when it comes to the migration of people, and this is true as Amanda just shared on in terms of birds, we tend to only regulate it within nation states rather than taking a global approach and an international approach and a collaborative approach. And I think as we are seeing, particularly because of climate, but also because of war, we have an increasing number of wars around the world that are actually also push factors in forcing people to migrate. And so we need to make sure that countries are collaborating and really looking at a managed regional approach and global approach to migration. Again, why are people leaving? What can we do as nation states, as governments? What can we do to have people have the freedom to stay in their home country? And I think this is where the USAID funding becomes really critical, which is how do we, I'll just use the United States in this example, invest in countries that are sending migrants where people are being forced to leave? How can that development aid help people build skills, have economic opportunities, become small business owners, rebuild their communities, et cetera? How do we have, one of the things that USAID has been doing has been increasing and expanding even existing temporary labor programs, right? So that there's more circular migration, right? So workers who live in, let's say El Salvador, or a lot of their focus has been in the Northern Triangle, so El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. How do the workers from those countries leave their home country, come to the United States or to another regional country, get some additional skills, contribute their existing skills, build additional funding and resources, and be able to go back, not just to their home, to their community, but then get additional assistance, financial assistance to build, perhaps start a small business or a transnational business from what they're working. So that's one thing. What I would say is that those programs, whether it's existing temporary worker programs or any new programs that are developed, absolutely must have labor rights and civil rights and human rights protected and part of them, because historically those programs have been basically kind of grounds for exploitation. And so we have to think creatively, and this really requires everyone who's impacted by migration of people, both the workers themselves, the labor activists, unions, business community, government officials at not just the federal level, but at the state and local level as well, to work together to really reimagine how do we provide the resources that people need, both to have the freedom to stay in their home country or to migrate, but to do so safely.
I have a thought-provoking question from Doug, and Amanda, I'm going to direct this at you. This is a doozy. How do birds learn and communicate the successes and failures of various migration locations so as to change migration patterns? Is there a lesson for humans? Do birds have the capacity to communicate this kind of stuff? Do you know what Doug's getting at?
To like cultural learning or knowledge among species?
Let's say birds go north and don't have success in, harvesting insects or something like that. Is there any communication going on among birds about successes or failures experienced during certain migratory patterns?
Yeah. So there are some different levels of that. So the strongest sort of feedback that we see shaping migration is going to be through natural selection, right? And so natural selection is simply when you have if a bird migrates to an area, it can't find the resources it needs, it dies during migration, it is removed, that behavior, because we know a lot of this, Maria Elena mentioned, there is also some genetic coding. And also a lot of birds show really high, what we call site fidelity, which means they return to the same places year after year for migrating. So I've studied cerulean warblers, and the same bird, individual bird, and we color mark them, will be breeding at a certain stand in Southeast Ohio. And when we work in Colombia on a coffee farm or in Venezuela, it's the same bird year after year, 6 years in a row, the same place. So when that bird no longer, if it dies, you just start losing individuals in that place, right? And the species, the individuals that are going to places where, they're able to find the resources they need, it was either a migratory path, or it was different stopover sites that were amenable to survival. That's the individual and the behaviors that are going to, survive and reproduce over time. So that's one of the big mechanisms where you see it. So in the past, when people have heard about changing migration patterns for birds and they're arriving earlier and earlier. So there are different drivers based on what the cues are that they're using to migrate. So sometimes for when the timing of migration or the routes are really hardwired. For those, what we're probably seeing, those changes for species are that in the past, the birds that arrive too early, they die. they're removed from the gene pool, and then we don't, they're not, increasing, in numbers over time, that behavior. Now we don't have that selection. So that's one way you see it. You also, though, have some species, especially some that are moving over shorter distances. As it's getting warmer, as they see leaves kind of emerging or insects that are emerging earlier, they can actually change in real time and respond to those cues. So you might imagine a bird that migrates to, the Gulf Shore, the southern US. It can pay attention to those cues in real time and make decisions. But for a bird who has to initiate migration from, the Amazon, well, it has no idea what's happening up north. So that's going to be, that's usually more of the hardwired. So yeah, over time, it's usually through that kind of passive selection where we're getting changes for the long distance migrants. And on a day-to-day, the kind of communication, birds will pay attention to other species, to other individuals, like in a flock, for good hints on like, oh, that looks good over there. I'm gonna head over there to try to forage for birds. But yeah, usually we don't get as much quickly. But really cool question.
I thought it was really cool, seeing cues within other species, right? They've just come back from lands far away, and boy, they don't look so good. That kind of stuff. I want to shift gears a little bit. Marielena, I want to move on. You've explained that perceptions like narratives around migration, excuse me, are more often negative than positive. Even though we've been just discussing here for 46 minutes how migration is natural. It's a positive adaptation, like we just discussed, a response to like changing conditions. How does this negativity manifest itself? What do we see?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Chris. And we're seeing the kind of the negativity increase exponentially because of technology, of course, right? Social media, misinformation, just all of that just makes our day-to-day living so much more complicated as human beings, which fortunately the birds do not have to deal with. But negative perceptions and xenophobia can often lead to discriminatory policies. It could lead to violent language, and perhaps most significant, the greatest consequence, of course, is that it could lead to death, to people dying as a result of that. And we see an increasing amount of that as immigration and the kind of like the political nature and the fact that immigration is being used as a wedge by authoritarian dictators and people who are really trying to use race and immigration as a wedge to divide people, and particularly to divide people and instill fear in people over Black and brown migrants who may be coming. And rather than really looking for those for policymakers, for leaders, whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, to look at real solutions that benefit all of us. Again, I think Amanda and I both have talked about this throughout the last hour about the importance of how do we take a more interdependent view of society where we are creating policies that actually improve the lives of everybody in a particular community or in a particular country, rather than addressing the need for housing or the need for quality jobs that pay a living wage, et cetera. Oftentimes what happens is the rhetoric by politicians is to use immigration as a way to deflect and blame immigrants for society's problems and for the lack of political and leadership, and rather than solving problems. And so that's one thing. And, we've seen in the United States, most recently, this playing out in a tiny town in Ohio, Springfield, Ohio, where there's misinformation, particularly from one political candidate, talking about people, particularly of Haitian migrants, supposedly eating people's pets and all of that. And it's been denounced. And you see, it being used, and, the pain, for example, of a father in Springfield, Ohio, who is begging the country to not use the death of his son who was injured, who died as of a bus accident, not to use his son and his son's name for political purposes. And so we're experiencing a real, I would say, low point in society, again, globally, not just in the United States, where immigration is being used as a wedge issue, resulting in very real human consequences for all of us.
So let's look at it from the other side if we could for a moment. So as natural as it is, migration, are there particular negatives or downsides to the movement of people? Let's be honest and talk about that. Amanda, I'll kick it over to you.
Right. Well, I could talk on the bird side too, right?
Yeah.
More like even from that. So, I mean, I think if I guess on the non-human side, let's say. So there are cases we know of people who are involved in conservation. You've probably heard us talking about invasive species, right? Invasive species are a major issue, and a threat to many ecosystems, and so there are negative consequences that can happen in those cases, where it's like taking over systems, and eroding our ability to maintain kind of the ecosystem services that are provided in different areas. We also have pandemics, right, that we're aware of, like the moving of different new viruses, among animals, and like these zoonotic diseases, right, animal-borne vectors. As mosquitoes are moving northward again, we're finding we're exposed increasingly to malaria or to dengue fever, those kinds of things. What I would say that overwhelmingly in these cases where you have these genuinely negative outcomes, the problem starts where these species are moving from. They're starting from changes to the system, right? They're starting with either, sloppy sort of trade that we're not being careful and we're moving species around the planet that have problems, or we're deforesting areas. We're putting roads into areas where previously they weren't, there, that are allowing new animals, animal viruses, other products to come out and to be transmitted elsewhere. So it's really changes to the systems, whether it's degrading areas that are forcing the movement of species into new places. We can think of predators sometimes moving into another area and causing human wildlife, human conflict. Well, that's because we're degrading and eliminating the habitats that they once depended on in most cases. So I would say, again, in most cases, by focusing on movement as the problem, we're actually reducing our capacity to avoid negative outcomes because we're focusing on the wrong place, right? We're not focusing on the reasons why there is that movement. And I would say, in most cases, if we focus on those reasons that are driving movements, so let's say I'm really worried about a negative outcome of a particular movement, or migration. If by focusing on what's driving that, I address that problem, maybe that negative outcome, but I'm also having even other positive outcomes, because by improving environments, if we have healthy environments, we're more likely to have, healthy ecosystems that are productive and support people and non-human species and support their livelihoods. I mean, over half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent upon nature's services, right? This is not an altruistic sort of proposition. If we are taking the steps to ensure that environments are healthy, we're actually supporting ourselves and other species and eliminating some of the negative outcomes from movement in some cases.
Maria-Elena's right there with you. I see her nodding, thinking the whole time, because you very well could have been talking about human beings the entire time.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, look, I'll just really briefly what I'll say. Two things. One is human migration can have profound social, economic, and cultural impacts on both the country of origin as well as the destination. And that includes everything from the impact on labor markets, demographic changes, cultural dynamics, and all of that. But the most important question we should always ask ourselves is why? Why is that person leaving their home country, right? What is it about what's happening in their local community where they were born, right? Where they have their entire infrastructure. Most people do not actually want to have to migrate to another country. I mean, just think about the grit, the stamina, the perseverance that it takes for someone to leave everything they know, the language, the culture, their loved ones, their stability, etc., to go to a foreign land where often they don't know the language, they don't know anyone, they don't know where they will live, how they will make a livelihood, etc., and the dangerous trajectory that sometimes people make across oceans or across land. And so it is really about, what is it about our economy? What is it about our society that has created, whether it's an extraction economy that has created the lack of jobs, right? That creates people having to leave. Trade policy, right? When the North American Free Trade Act was passed, that resulted in many people in Mexico, in rural communities and agricultural communities, having to leave because there was no farming jobs available. And it just, people start traveling. And so again, that importance of what Amanda, I just would just say +1 to everything Amanda just said, replace all of the times she said birds or other species and just think about people. But it is about the reason. And we don't do enough, frankly, both as in academia, in government, and nonprofits, to think about the root causes of migration of all species. And that has to be part of the way we think, and to do so at a global level as well.
So Marielena, I want to stick with you. So what do you hope our viewers take away from a conversation like this? What would you like to see? Where do people go from here?
Yeah. So first of all, just thank you again, Chris, to you and your team at Cornell, and to all of the viewers. Look, as we mentioned earlier at the outset, our motivation for this was to get the message out, right, from two very different perspectives. But hopefully everybody has seen that actually we really do need to start changing and reimagining and rethinking migration of all species. And today we're focusing primarily on people and birds, but that migration is a global phenomenon, a natural phenomenon, that people and all birds and species will continue to migrate. And that what we need to do is to really look at, as Amanda said, migration not as the problem, but really look at the underlying causes and reasons. And then also look at this from a global perspective. How do we, across countries, both nation states and local governments, and all of us from our different perches, how do we contribute to building a more equitable society, a more sustainable society where all of us, right, the planet, all living beings, birds and people, get to thrive?
Amanda, I want to kick it over to you. Let's talk about how we can make more friendly bird-friendly communities, rather. Just kind of, getting to some resources here, some action steps for our viewers. So you've got some recommendations. What have you got?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you'll be sharing a link for the 7 simple actions that we can take that to give people some ideas. And so there are many simple steps you can take, right? Providing habitat in your backyard, planting, certain species, especially like species that are native to a particular area. And so the animals have evolved with those. You can make bird-friendly sort of choices with housing design. Put decals up so birds aren't going to hit your windows and die. Reduce collision threats. Keep your cats inside. Buy bird-friendly products. There's a bunch of different actions you can list. And I would say too, the choices you make, about, how to engage civically, civic engagement is really important. The choices of local, state, federal elections do actually have, serious outcomes. And thinking of that, and conservation organizations you support, those are other ways to really amplify the efforts that you're taking at home. And too, for those of you into migration, you can check out Birdcast tonight. That shows like real time and 3-day windows forecasting where you're going to see a lot of migration. And we send out alerts, these lights out alerts. So you can actually turn out lights, cities can turn out lights to reduce threats to migrating birds. So those are two kind of some fun ways you can engage.
Marielena tipped us to ways we can create more people-friendly communities through some links to Welcome Week. Any quick words on that, Marielena?
Yeah, no, just serendipity that we have this event today that we're talking here, and it happens to be Welcoming Week across the globe. And that is an event that, or a series of events all over the world, but especially in the United States, it's being led by an organization called Welcoming America. And you can click on the map on this link and find a location near you where you can find one of these events. It's a really great way. And then there's also welcome.us that is focusing particularly on how people can become sponsors of refugees who are coming to the United States as well.
You have a story for us about art and creativity as it relates to what we've been discussing today. Tell me about this.
Yeah, so I wanted to close, I think, as we talk about these global issues and talk about all species, et cetera, just to bring it home to an individual. And so I wanted to share the story of Juan, who is a teenager who arrived about 3 years ago at the US-Mexico border. He was a really smart boy back with great musical and artistic skills. He was escaping gang violence and threats to both his life and his family's life in El Salvador, and made the dangerous journey north in search of safety. He was detained in Arizona, and while he was waiting to be reunited with some family members here in the United States, he was in detention. And he used coffee grounds to create paint, to paint this beautiful little bird. I think it's a little duck. And once he was reunited, his family gifted this painting to my sister, Gloria, who was assisting his family in Florida. And every time I look at this, especially when I visit her and I can see the actual little painting, I'm just blown away and just really touched by Juan's ingenuity, his creativity, and the skills. And it makes me wonder, here's this teenager in detention, in immigrant detention, away from anyone and everything, probably petrified about what his future holds, and found the resilience and the creativity to use coffee grounds to paint. And it just makes me wonder, right? What if we had the moral imagination to envision a world where we see people's human potential as a society? And what if we set everyone to have the freedom to thrive, right? Whether they're born here or coming by temporarily or coming permanently. And what if we saw newcomers, right? Whether they are our new neighbors who moved from across town or from another state or another country? What if we saw them with an abundance and generous lens rather than one that is based on fear?
Amen. Maria Elena, Amanda, thank you so much for joining on the show today. I should mention to our viewers, and thank you for the questions, viewers, and your engagement through the conversation today. We're going to have a post-election keynote called Immigration Reform in 2025. What is possible? We're going to be doing this on November 20th. We're going to share the URL if anybody's interested in what we can hope to accomplish, which way the political winds are blowing in late October, and you'll be part of a panel from Cornell Law on that one. So again, lovely to have you both on the show. Thanks, viewers. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.